This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 700, ta-da! Entitled, What Masculists Expect from Women. Description. This flyer explains what Masculists expect from women, namely three things: that women become FIPs, become biconscious, and vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws. Flyer itself. What Masculists Expect from Women by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer lists what Masculists expect from women, presented initially in bulleted format, followed by a more detailed discussion of each bulleted item in the list. Here is the bulleted list. Bullet. Masculists expect women to be FIPs. Bullet. Masculists expect women to be biconscious. Bullet. Masculists expect women to vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws. And here are the details for each item in the above list. Bullet. Masculists expect women to be FIPs. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against working for women for decades of their lives. Thus, fluffy women, in brackets, fluffy, equals traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus man-slaving him, and for one father in four, divorce raping him, ruining his life, close brackets, are seen by masculists as man-slavers who parasite off men, making this a horrible, decades-lasting gender crime by fluffies against men. Masculists are abolitionists who see man-slavery as literally 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery, given the numbers. The immorality of Negro slavery was the root cause of the US Civil War that cost the lives of over 600,000 soldiers. Masculists tell women that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women science-based medicine that allows women today to have a life expectancy of 85 years. It was men who invented the contraceptive pill, giving women the option of having as few kids as they choose. Today, most advanced nations' women choose to have 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases. Masculists claim that with women's 85-year life expectancy and less than 3 kids per woman, women now can work, so they now must work. Anything else being seen by masculists as man-slavery, and man-slavery will get women killed. There were several million Negro slaves in America in the 1830s when William Lloyd Garrison started his abolitionist newspaper in 1831 entitled The Liberator, which was the first public expression of anti-slavery in the US. So Garrison was the first public abolitionist in the US. The abolitionist spark he lit within a mere 3 decades led to the US Civil War, whose primary cause was the immorality of Negro slavery. Masculists are abolitionists, seeing fluffydom as man-slavery, and man-slavery as slavery, as something to be hated and a war issue. Masculists are at war against fluffies and aim to wipe them out by totally ignoring them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable deaths, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, utterly rejected by masculisted men, both socially and sexually. Masculists put powerful moral pressure on fluffies to get career competent educations at high school and college so that they can be FIPs, financially independent persons, as adults, and not expect, fluffy style, to live off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades. Masculists see clearly that most of men's gender issues will be solved by creating a FIP society, that is, one in which both sexes are socialised and educated to be FIPs. With all women being FIPs, there will be no more manslavery. With all women being FIPs, the divorce courts can be thoroughly reformed, basing them on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties. Alimony can be thrown out. Custody of kids will be made joint by default. There will be no halving of wealth nor stuff, since all women will be seen to be FIPs. From the above, it should be clear that the FIPPing of women is vital to the Masculist political program, and that this is why Masculists place such moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, or be forced to rot on the shelf, spat at by men, and effectively exterminated for not being FIPs. Bullet. Masculists expect women to be biconscious. If a feminist is not biconscious, in brackets, that is, she has not had both her feminist and her masculist consciousnesses raised, that is, she's not familiar with both sets of gender political arguments, that is, feminist and masculist, close brackets, then she is by definition monoconscious. And it is the experience of biconscious masculists that monoconscious feminists tend to be rather feminazi bitchy, because they are angry at men for the ways that men oppress women, as taught them by feminism, which makes such women a pain in the arse to be with. After 6 decades of feminist monopoly of gender politics, most young women today have been deeply influenced by feminist ideas on how men oppress women. So it's not surprising that now in the US, 2/3 of young men don't even date young women, claiming that young women are, quote, undateable due to being, quote, too poisoned by feminism. A biconscious feminist, on the other hand, by definition, has had both her feminist and her masculist consciousnesses raised. So she sees that gender oppression is very much a two-way street. That is, that women oppress men as well. Once she becomes familiar with the big 3 ways that women oppress men, that the masculists keep harping on, in brackets, that is, the worst 3 ways that women oppress men, that is, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering, close brackets, she becomes conscious that to express publicly that men oppress women and be angry about it would be hypocritical, given that she's now aware that in fact women oppress men so much worse with the big 3 ways that women oppress men. So she loses her monoconscious feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women by having that anger cancelled by her female masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men. And far worse, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades. For example, the big 3, making them a lot more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. Brackets, for example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, patriarchy, misogyny, etc. Close brackets. So once a former monoconscious feminist has become a biconscious feminist, she loses her monoconscious anger at men and hence becomes a lot nicer for men to be with. So she's much more likely to have and to keep a boyfriend, which is obviously beneficial to both sexes. So the biconsciousing of women, especially of monoconscious feminists, benefits women individually, but there's also a much more serious cultural phenomenon that the biconsciousing of women will affect. And that is that there will be a probable rise in the birth rate, thus solving the awful problem of the horrific crash in the birth rate, which in time will cause human beings to go extinct. Obviously, if 2/3 of young men in the US don't even date, then that simple fact will be the major factor in causing the catastrophic crash in the birth rate. In South Korea now, the birth rate is under 0.7 kids per woman. So South Koreans will not be with us for much longer, because in only a few generations they will wipe themselves out. Masculists see monoconscious feminists as genociders, that is, genociders at a planetary scale, because monoconscious feminists have made young women so repulsive to be with for young men that young men don't even date young women. 2/3 of young men in the US, in fact, close brackets. So the solution to this dominant reason why young men don't date women and hence don't mate with them to increase the birth rate is to push for the biconsciousing of women, that is, teaching their masculist ideas so that they lose their monoconscious feminazi bitchiness and hence become nicer and a lot more approachable for young men. Upper middle class educated young men simply expect similarly socially positioned young women to be biconscious, simply on fairness grounds, the way these educated young women expect similarly socially positioned young men to be male feminists, that is, for reasons of fairness. These young women expect young men to think that women should have the vote and be given equal rights and opportunities as men for reasons of simple fairness. Similarly, biconscious masculists expect young women to have corresponding masculist values, again for reasons of simple fairness, thinking that, yes, men should have the paternity rejection right, given that women already have the maternity rejection right, that women should be FIPs, that society should be biconscious, that GECs, GECs, gender equality committees, should be set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminist politicians and half of male masculist politicians, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, and that legal and social discriminations against men should be systematically removed by these GECs. Bullet. Masculists expect women to vote with men for the men fairing of the gender laws. The longer that monoconscious feminism exists, the less likely it will be that men get gender justice. Monoconscious feminism is a deeply misandrist, genocentric ideology that preaches to women that gender oppression is a one-way street, that men oppress women and that women are the oppressed. Monoconscious feminism says nothing about how women oppress men. So masculists push monoconscious feminists to learn masculist ideas so that they become biconscious and hence much more likely to help men achieve gender justice. For example, legislating the para and the OPTAB, that's obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to block women's awful gender crime of paternity fraud, reforming the divorce courts, laws, etc. Masculists preach to young women that it is in these